The leaders of the Mexican War of Independence, there wasn't one clear message all across all these folks. And the reasons for independence evolved over time. So the spark of independence was to take down the colonial government of Mexico City that they believed was under the control of the French. At the time, they basically viewed the European Spaniards as sellouts. And so they wanted to topple them. And that's what they did. You have to remember, a lot of what we think about history today is almost written by political activists. When you look at, now, for me, I'm a genealogist, okay? So I don't really care about the politics one way or another of this stuff. I care about finding people's families. When you look back at these documents and what they were actually fighting for, these were people at a time, they built the society they live in, okay? I know we like to think of like these Spaniards that just kind of come over and rape and pillage and then go back home to Spain. That's not really how it played out in most cases, okay? I'm not saying that like tragedies didn't occur, because tragedies did occur, but not everybody experienced colonialism in the same way. At the time of independence, these were folks that lived in the colonial system. They lived in cities, they had homes, they had property, they had, their farm that they, maybe it was just a small plot of farm where they could grow vegetables. And they were sick and tired of being controlled by people from Spain. It's not that they hated Spanish things or they hated Spanish blood. It wasn't like that, because a lot of people were Spanish themselves. They didn't like being controlled from a government on a different continent. They believed, and at the time it was true, Mexico was the most wealthy place in the entire Spanish Empire, including Spain. Mexico City was a bigger place than Madrid. Mexico was a gigantic place. Now remember, at the time of independence, Mexico was like half of North America. It was a big, big place. And so they saw themselves as a more prestigious part of the empire than Spain itself. And they were sick and tired of being controlled by people from Madrid. They didn't hate the king, they didn't hate Catholicism, and evidence proves that. They kept Catholicism as a requirement of citizenship. They even offered the King of Spain to rule over Mexico as an independent country, but they didn't want to be controlled by bureaucrats, by Spanish bureaucrats in Madrid. Think about this. And think about this, okay? 200 years ago, your ancestors were the descendants of, conquistadors and, Spanish settlers who built big cities. And you're also the descendants of, these Tlaxcala and Mexica warriors and these very prestigious people that won these very prestigious wars and built these magnificent cities. And so you have some like prestige in your own name, in your own last name. We love our last names, right? So you had this prestige in your family. And then all of a sudden, some middle-class guy from, Spain, who never did anything with his life, who just had maybe a college degree or something, all of a sudden he comes to Mexico and he's your boss. And you're like, wait a minute. Like, I'm the descendant of so-and-so. My family has lived in this town for, hundreds or thousands of years in some case. And so you're in your country, in your town, and all of a sudden this guy from Spain comes, and just because he's from Spain, he gets to be the mayor, or he gets to be your boss. It was a difference in prestige. And so Mexicans got very fed up with that. And so after the Mexican War of Independence, they expelled people from Spain. They expelled them. They passed laws to actually make people, if they were born in Spain, not if they were Spanish themselves, not that. It was, were you born in Spain? Okay, either accept Mexican citizenship or you have to leave. And they actually expelled like 14,000 people who were born in Spain. They basically told everybody in the colonies, like, hey, if you're born in Spain, you either accept Mexican citizenship or you got to go. And so it's a very fascinating part in Mexican history. Does anybody have any questions on that? I know like the way we talk about history is like the Aztec Empire was conquered and we were like, there was like this indigenous resistance, and we just kind of held out for 300 years, and then boom, we like exploded and overthrew the Spaniards. Like, that's kind of mythology. I'm sorry, like I know like some of you are going to be upset about that. That's kind of mythology. It's a good story that we tell ourselves, but in reality what it is basically what we have is a narrative where there were tons of colonial abuses. So like, just getting that on the table. But there was two different like narratives happening. There's one where Spaniards come, they conquer Mexico City, and like they make this alliance with the Tlaxcalans, and they make all these alliances with a lot of different indigenous tribes. And those are the ones that go to colonize. Okay? So wherever the Spanish colonized, they took indigenous people with them who were their allies to fight back against their indigenous enemies. Okay? There was indigenous allies and indigenous enemies. The Spaniards, wherever they colonized, they set up two different cities. They would set up a República de Españoles, and they would set up a República de Indios, and they would live side by side with each other. The vast majority of the people in the armed forces were indigenous people. And out of this coexistence that they had, we had a mixed race population develop. And that's who we are today. Whenever indigenous people would lose wars, if they surrendered to the Spanish, they were like absorbed into the colonial system, and they just became allies, and they would coexist together. And this happened for 300 years. So there was a lot of coexistence that had to happen. If you were an indigenous enemy, you'd be captured, in some cases put into slavery, worked to death. So there was a lot of colonial era abuses as well. But there was also a lot of coexistence. And we have to kind of depoliticize our minds when we look at our ancestry, okay? Because when you start to do your ancestry and you start to look at the actual documents, you find out in a lot of cases that you were part of this alliance and you were part of this coexistence that was happening. You find marriage records. The majority of the Spaniards in Mexico were Mexican-born Spaniards, and like they stayed in Mexico. They never went back to Spain because they were born in Mexico, and they were the ones who worked for the government. There was two governments. There was República de Españoles, República de Indios. There was never a República de Mestizos, okay? There was never a time, the Spanish government never found a way to fully incorporate mixed race people fairly into the empire. There were laws to protect indigenous allies, and there were laws to protect Spaniards, but they were very, very like non-committal towards mixed race people. And that ultimately was one factor that led to independence, because there was people that were disenfranchised. Mestizos and mulattoes were disenfranchised with both systems. And that's why you see people like Morelos, who is mixed race. You see people like Vicente Guerrero, who is mixed race, who were very committed to independence and taking over the government in Mexico City and ending these racial classifications. The Spaniards, if they would have just found ways to like accommodate mixed race people, they probably wouldn't have, independence maybe wouldn't have happened or would have unfolded differently. There was never a way to fully incorporate us, because most of us are mixed now, right? Like 92% of Mexicans are mestizo to some degree. That actually flourished after independence as well. At the time of independence, maybe only 18% of the population or thereabout was mixed race. And once they eliminated racial classifications after 1822, there was like this flourishing of mixed race marriages, and then to the point where we're all mixed now.